You're 7 years old, living in the deep forests of the Congo. Today, you're helping your father collect resin from the rubber trees. When the Belgian officer arrives, your father's basket isn't full enough. The officer says something to his soldiers, the ones they call the force public. They grab you. Your father is begging, swearing he'll collect more rubber. But the officer shakes his head. No, he says calmly. Punishment is necessary. They learn from the children. The sharp machete glints in the sunlight. You don't even have time to scream before it comes down. The pain is so intense it takes your breath away. When you look down, you see your own right hand there, on the ground, no longer attached to you. The officer tosses it into a basket. With the other hands, small hands, large hands, brown fingers forming a pile. Quota, the officer says, writing something in his ledger. Today's quota is complete, but you don't hear him. You're fainting in your father's arms, in shock. You'll wake up, you'll heal, but you'll never be the same again. And this is just the beginning, because in King Leopold's Congo, children's hands are cheaper than rubber. Before diving into what may be history's most horrific but least discussed genocide, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared need to bear witness to suffering that the world tried to forget. The story begins not in Africa, but in Brussels, in the gilded halls of European power where a king dreamed of empire. Leopold II became King of Belgium in 1865, inheriting a small, young nation that had only existed since 1830. Belgium was prosperous, industrial, and utterly lacking in the one thing that defined greatness in the late 19th century: colonies. Britain had India, France had Algeria, the Netherlands had Indonesia, Portugal had Angola, even tiny Portugal had colonies. But Belgium? Nothing. This ate at Leopold constantly. He watched other European nations grow wealthy from colonial exploitation and felt his kingdom diminishing in comparison. He tried to purchase territories, offering to buy the Philippines from Spain, attempting to lease parts of Borneo, even proposing to buy an island in the Pacific. Every attempt failed. Belgium's parliament had no interest in colonial adventures, viewing them as expensive distractions from domestic development. But Leopold was nothing if not persistent, and when he learned about the vast, unclaimed territories in Central Africa, he found his opportunity. The Congo Basin was enormous, larger than all of Western Europe combined, rich in ivory and potentially other resources, and crucially, unclaimed by any European power. The various kingdoms and communities that actually lived there didn't count, of course, not in the eyes of 19th century Europe. If no white nation had planted a flag, the land was considered empty, available for taking. Leopold's genius, if we can call calculated evil genius, was in his marketing. He didn't present himself as a greedy monarch seeking personal enrichment. Instead, he positioned himself as a humanitarian, a philanthropist who wanted to bring civilization and Christianity to the dark continent. In 1876, he organized the Brussels Geographical Conference, gathering explorers and intellectuals to discuss African development. He established the International African Association, supposedly dedicated to scientific exploration and ending the Arab slave trade in East Africa. The rhetoric was beautiful. To open to civilization the only part of our globe which it has not yet penetrated, to pierce the darkness which hangs over entire peoples, Leopold declared, is, I dare say, a crusade worthy of this century of progress. European intellectuals applauded. The Vatican blessed his mission. Churches across Europe raised funds to support the civilizing work. But Leopold's real intentions were very different. He hired Henry Morton Stanley, the famous explorer, to travel throughout the Congo Basin, signing treaties with local chiefs. These treaties, written in French or English languages the chiefs couldn't read, supposedly granted sovereignty to Leopold personally. Most chiefs thought they were signing trade agreements or friendship pacts. They had no concept that they were supposedly surrendering their land and people to a foreign king they'd never heard of. In 1885, at the Berlin Conference where European powers carved up Africa like a cake, Leopold got what he wanted. The major powers recognized his personal ownership of the Congo Free State. Not Belgian ownership, personal ownership. An area of 2.3 million square kilometers, 80 times the size of Belgium itself, became the private property of one man. It was unprecedented. Leopold owned an entire country the way you might own a house or a farm. Initially, the Congo Free State generated wealth through ivory. Elephant tusks were valuable in Europe for piano keys, billiard balls, and decorative items. But ivory had a problem. Elephants were finite. You could only kill so many before they became scarce. Leopold needed a renewable resource, something that could generate endless profit. He found it in rubber. The invention of the pneumatic tire in 1888 created explosive demand for rubber. Automobiles were becoming popular. Bicycles were everywhere. everywhere. Rubber was needed for electrical insulation as industrial development accelerated. And the Congo had rubber trees, lots of them, Landolphia vines that produced latex when cut. Suddenly, Leopold's personal colony sitting on what amounted to a gold mine. But there was a problem. The rubber was wild, not planted in orderly plantations. It grew scattered throughout the vast jungle. Harvesting it required intensive labor, sending workers deep into the forest to find the vines, cut them, collect the latex, and transport it back to collection points. This was hard, dangerous, time-consuming work, and the Congolese people, quite reasonably, had their own lives to live. They had their own farms to tend, their own communities to maintain, their own economic systems that had functioned for centuries. Leopold's solution was simple: force. He established a system where the entire Congo was divided into territories, each with quotas for rubber collection. Every village was assigned a quantity of rubber they had to deliver regularly. If they failed to meet the quota, punishment followed. Brutal, systematic, unimaginable punishment designed to terrorize entire populations into compliance. The force public was Leopold's enforcement arm. Officially, it was a military force to maintain order. In reality, it was a terrorist organization. Composed of African soldiers led by white Belgian officers, the force public's primary job was ensuring rubber quotas were met by any means necessary. And any means necessary quickly became a euphemism for atrocities that shocked even the colonial sensibilities of the era. The system worked like this: villages were given quotas. Men were required to go into the forest for weeks at a time, leaving their farms unattended, searching for rubber vines, collecting latex. While the men were gone, their wives and children were held hostage in special camps, starved and abused to ensure the men would return with rubber rather than escape. When rubber quotas weren't met, punishments escalated rapidly. The chikot was the first level of punishment. This was a whip made from dried hippopotamus hide, cut into a sharp-edged strip. A single blow would tear through skin. 10 blows would expose bone. 20 blows often proved fatal. Children as young as 5 were subjected to the chikot for their father's failure to meet quotas. Missionary accounts describe watching children whipped until they died, their small bodies unable to withstand the trauma. But the punishment that has become most associated with Leopold's Congo, the one that finally broke through European indifference when photographs eventually leaked out, was the systematic mutilation of hands and feet. If a village failed to meet its quota, force public soldiers would cut off the hands of village members as punishment. And not just adults. Children were preferred targets because their mutilation sent a more powerful message. Nothing motivates a parent like the threat to their child. The process was horrifically routine. Soldiers would enter a village that had failed to meet its quota. They would select victims, often children, because children couldn't fight back and their mutilation devastated communities most effectively. The victim would be held down. A machete would be used to sever the hand, usually the right hand, sometimes both hands, sometimes feet as well. The wounds would be cauterized with burning oil or hot metal to prevent immediate death from blood loss, not out of mercy, but to ensure the victim survived as a living warning to others. The severed hands were collected in baskets and brought back to white officers as proof that punishment had been administered. This created its own horror. Soldiers were issued limited ammunition and had to account for every bullet fired. If they used bullets for hunting or wasted them in other ways, they had to provide evidence, typically in the form of severed hands, to prove they had used the bullets to kill rebels or enforce quotas. This led to soldiers cutting off the hands of living people, including children, simply to cover up their ammunition use. Imagine being that 7-year-old child from our opening. Your father tried his best. He went into the forest for days at a time. He climbed trees to reach the rubber vines. He collected what he could, but it wasn't enough. The quota is always impossible. That's the point. The quotas are designed to be unattainable, ensuring that punishment is always necessary, keeping the population in constant terror. When the soldiers arrive, your father tries to protect you, but he's one man against armed soldiers. They tear you from his grasp. You don't understand what's happening. You've heard stories whispered around nighttime fires about the hand cutting, but those were stories, weren't they? Things that happened to other children in other villages. Not to you. The pain when the machete comes down is beyond anything you've experienced. Your scream echoes through the forest. Your father's anguished cries mix with your own. The soldier who cut your hand shows no emotion. This is his job. He does it every day. He picks up your severed hand, examines it to ensure it's a clean cut that will be accepted by his superior, and tosses it into his basket with the others. Some are smaller than yours. Some are larger. All of them were attached to people just moments ago. The burning oil they pour on your stump to stop the bleeding hurts almost as much as the initial cut. You pass out from the pain. When you wake, you're in your family's hut. Your mother is crying. Your father sits motionless, staring at nothing. Your arm ends in a mass of burned flesh and crude bandaging. changing. The fever will start soon. Infection is almost inevitable given the unsanitary conditions and lack of medical care. Most children who undergo this mutilation die within days from infection or shock. But let's say you're one of the lucky ones. You survive. The stump heals after a fashion. You're 7 years old with one hand. In a subsistence agricultural society, you've just become a burden rather than an asset. You can't climb trees to gather fruit. You can't use a machete to clear fields. You can't paddle a canoe effectively. Simple tasks become monumental challenges. Tying things, carrying things, eating. Everything requires adaptation. But the physical disability is only part of your burden. The psychological trauma runs deeper. You have nightmares constantly. The sound of men's voices makes you panic. The sight of baskets fills you with inexplicable dread until you remember they were carrying hands in baskets. Your hand was in one of those baskets. You develop a phantom limb sensation, feeling your missing hand itch and ache even though it's long gone, probably burned or buried somewhere. Your village changes after that day. The men collect more rubber, pushing themselves to exhaustion and beyond. Your mother is gaunt from being held hostage in the starvation camp while your father was in the forest. Your little sister died there, her small body unable to withstand weeks of deliberate starvation. 2 of your friends were shot when their fathers tried to run away rather than collect rubber. Another friend lost both hands and both feet and died screaming 3 days later when infection set in. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was systematic policy across the entire Congo Free State. Conservative estimates suggest at least 2 million hands were severed during Leopold's rule. Given that many victims died before their mutilations could be recorded, and many incidents were never documented at all, the true number was likely much higher. And more than half of these victims were children. Why children? Several reasons, all coldly calculated. First, children were easier to catch and restrain than adults. Second, mutilating children had a more powerful psychological effect on communities, breaking the will to resist more effectively than punishing adults. Third, children's hands were actually preferred for the collection baskets because they were smaller and more hands could fit in a basket, making it easier for soldiers to prove they had administered sufficient punishment. The bureaucracy of atrocity had its own sick logic, but the hand-cutting, horrific as it was only one part of a larger system of terror. Villages that resisted rubber collection weren't just punished, they were destroyed. Forced public soldiers would surround a village, set the buildings on fire, and shoot anyone who tried to escape. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. The goal was to create such overwhelming fear that other villages would comply rather than risk similar treatment. The hostage system was another key component. While men were in the forest collecting rubber, their families were held in special camps called camps de rassemblement. These were concentration camps in all but name. Women and children were kept in horrific conditions, given minimal food, subjected to violence and sexual abuse, all to ensure the men would return with rubber. The mortality rate in these camps was staggering. Estimates suggest that half of all hostages died before their men returned. Sexual violence was endemic throughout the system. Forced public soldiers viewed Congolese women and girls as spoils of war. Rape was so common that it barely warranted mention in most accounts. Girls as young as 8 or 9 were taken as wives by soldiers, meaning they were kept as sexual slaves. When these girls became pregnant, they were sometimes released, but often kept until their babies were born. Then the infants were killed and the mothers put back to work in the hostage camps. The system consumed children in other ways too. Boys around 10 or 12 were sometimes forcibly recruited into the forced public itself, torn from their families and trained to terrorize other communities. This was psychological warfare, turning Congolese against Congolese, ensuring that the violence couldn't be simply framed as white against black, but rather as a more complex system where some black Africans were complicit in the oppression of others. These child soldiers were often given the worst assignments, forced to cut off hands or burn villages in their own regions, traumatizing them while implicating them in atrocities. Disease compounded the direct violence. The forced labor system destroyed traditional agricultural patterns. With men in the forest for weeks at a time and women held in camps, crops weren't planted or tended. Famine became widespread. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. When diseases swept through, as they regularly did, the death toll was catastrophic. Smallpox, sleeping sickness, and other diseases killed millions. Children, with their less developed immune systems and greater vulnerability to malnutrition, died in disproportionate numbers. The scale of death in the Congo Free State is difficult to comprehend. Population estimates from before Leopold's takeover suggest around 20 million people lived in the Congo Basin. By 1924, when the first reliable census was conducted, the population was around 10 million. That means roughly 10 million people died during Leopold's rule and its immediate aftermath. To put this in perspective, this is comparable to the Holocaust in terms of absolute numbers, and actually represents represents a higher percentage of the affected population. Children made up a disproportionate share of these deaths. Beyond those killed directly through mutilation, shooting, or burning, countless more died from starvation, disease, and the collapse of their societies. When the international community finally began investigating conditions in the Congo, they found entire regions depopulated. Villages that once held hundreds of people were empty or contained only a handful of survivors. The survivors' accounts consistently mention children dying first, their smaller bodies unable to withstand the combined assault of violence, starvation, and disease. For years, Leopold successfully kept the truth hidden from the world. He controlled all information flowing out of the Congo. Missionaries who tried to report atrocities were expelled. Journalists were forbidden entry. The few accounts that leaked out were dismissed as exaggerations or fabrications by Leopold's paid propagandists. He continued to present himself as a humanitarian, even as his private fortune grew astronomically from rubber profits extracted through systematic terror. The tide began to turn in the early 1900s when photographs started reaching Europe. A missionary named Alice Seeley Harris took now-famous photographs of mutilation victims. One shows a man named Nsala sitting beside his daughter's severed hand and foot, all that remained after forced public soldiers killed her. Another shows a young boy staring at his own severed hand. These images were impossible to dismiss or explain away. They provided undeniable evidence of what was happening in Leopold's private colony. Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, published in 1899, also began shifting public perception. Though fictional, it was based on Conrad's own experiences in the Congo and captured the moral horror of the system. The character of Kurtz, who descends into madness and brutality in the jungle, was seen by many as representing the reality of European civilization in Africa. E.D. Morel, a British shipping clerk, became one of the most effective activists against Leopold's regime. Morel noticed something odd. Ships heading to the Congo were full of weapons and ammunition, but ships returning were full of rubber and ivory. If the Congo were truly being developed, you'd expect to see trade goods, machinery, manufactured items going in. Instead, it was just weapons. This suggested the rubber wasn't being purchased but stolen at gunpoint. Morel founded the Congo Reform Association in 1904 and began campaigning vigorously against Leopold's regime. He was joined by Roger Casement, a British diplomat who had served in the Congo and witnessed atrocities firsthand. Casement's official report to the British government in 1904 detailed systematic murder, mutilation, and enslavement. The report caused an international scandal. Even with mounting evidence and growing international pressure, Leopold fought to maintain his control. He burned most of the records of his Congo administration to prevent them from being used as evidence. He hired publicists to attack his critics. He claimed the atrocity reports were exaggerated or fabricated by enemies of Belgium. He insisted he was a misunderstood philanthropist whose humanitarian work was being slandered. But the evidence was overwhelming. Too many witnesses, too many photographs, too many bodies. In 1908, the Belgian government finally forced Leopold to relinquish his personal ownership of the Congo. It became a Belgian colony rather than a private possession. Leopold received massive compensation for giving up his property, essentially being paid for relinquishing control over a territory where he had orchestrated genocide. Leopold died in 1909, 1 year after losing the Congo. He never faced justice for his crimes. He was never tried, never punished, never forced to account for the millions who died under his rule. He died wealthy, comfortable, and largely unrepentant. In his final years, he spent his rubber fortune on grand construction projects in Belgium, building monuments and palaces that still stand today, beautiful structures built on foundations of millions of corpses. The Congo itself was devastated in ways that persisted long after Belgian colonial rule ended in 1960. The population had been cut in half. Traditional social structures had been destroyed. Communities had been scattered. The trauma was so deep and pervasive that it shaped Congolese society for generations. The violence and instability that have plagued the region ever since can be traced directly back to the systematic destruction wrought during Leopold's rule. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this story is how thoroughly it has been forgotten or minimized. Ask most people about major genocides and they'll mention the Holocaust, maybe the Armenian genocide, possibly Rwanda. Very few will mention the Congo Free State, despite it being comparable in scale to any of these. This forgetting isn't accidental. It's the result of deliberate choices about which histories we preserve and which we let fade. Part of the reason is timing. The worst atrocities in the Congo occurred before the age of mass media, before television could bring images of suffering into people's homes instantaneously. The photographs that did emerge were shocking but limited in number and distribution. By the time the full scale became clear, Leopold had destroyed most of the records, and other crises had captured captured the world's attention. Part of the reason is racism. The victims were black Africans, and in the early 20th century, black lives simply didn't command the same attention or sympathy as white lives. The same European nations that eventually pressured Leopold to give up the Congo were themselves running brutal colonial systems elsewhere in Africa. They condemned Leopold's excesses while perpetrating similar violence in their own colonies. The outrage was selective, directed at someone who made colonialism look bad rather than at colonialism itself. And part of the reason is that Belgium, unlike Germany after the Holocaust, never had a national reckoning with this history. There was no Nuremberg trial for Leopold's crimes, no Truth and Reconciliation Commission, no monuments to the victims. Belgian textbooks for decades barely mentioned the Congo or presented it as a civilizing mission that had some unfortunate side effects. Only recently have there been serious efforts to confront this history honestly, and even these remain controversial. Today, if you walk through Brussels, you'll see statues of Leopold II. Grand boulevards bear his name. Buildings he commissioned with rubber money stand as monuments to his reign. There have been some removals and modifications in recent years following protests, but much of his commemoration remains. Imagine if statues of Hitler stood in Berlin, or if streets were named after architects of the Holocaust. That's essentially what exists in Belgium regarding Leopold. The children of the Congo, the ones who lost their hands, the ones who died in hostage camps, the ones who were shot or burned or worked to death, they have no monuments. Their names are mostly unknown. Their stories were buried with their bodies. But they were real. They lived and suffered and died in one of history's great atrocities. Think about that 7-year-old from our opening. He was a real child, or rather, he represents hundreds of thousands of real children who experienced exactly this. What were his dreams before the soldiers came? Did he want to be a hunter like his father? Did he have a favorite game he played with friends? Did he love his mother's cooking? Did he fear the dark? All the normal things that 7-year-olds think about, all of that was destroyed in a single moment when a machete came down. And his father, who had to watch his child mutilated as punishment for failing to meet an impossible quota set by a foreign king he'd never met, what kind of psychological hell did he endure? How do you continue living after witnessing that? How do you look at your child's stump and not go mad with rage and grief? And yet, he had to keep collecting rubber because if he didn't, his other children would be next. This pattern repeated across the entire Congo, in thousands of villages, affecting millions of families. The trauma was so widespread and profound that it became part of the collective memory of the region. Grandparents would tell stories to grandchildren about the time of the red rubber, when the forests ran with blood and children's hands-filled baskets. These stories were often dismissed as exaggerations or folktales by outside observers. But they were true. All of it was true. The economic logic behind the atrocities is as disturbing as the violence itself. Leopold extracted an estimated 220 million francs from the Congo, equivalent to over $1 billion today. Every franc was purchased with blood. The beautiful buildings in Brussels, the monuments to Leopold's greatness, all of it was built with money generated by systematic mutilation and murder. And the rubber itself, where did it go? It went into tires for European automobiles and bicycles. It went into insulation for the electrical systems powering European cities. It went into industrial equipment driving European economic growth. The entire continent was benefiting from Congolese suffering. When Europeans rode their bicycles or drove their cars or turned on their electric lights, they were using products made possible by the severed hands of African children. This is the reality of colonialism that often gets sanitized in historical accounts. We talk about the scramble for Africa as if it were a game. We discuss colonial administration as if it were merely bureaucracy. We describe resource extraction as if it were a neutral economic process. But behind every one of these antiseptic terms is violence, torture, murder, and the systematic destruction of human beings, especially children, who were the most vulnerable and therefore the most targeted. The missionaries who witnessed these atrocities and tried to report them faced incredible resistance. William Shepherd, an African-American Presbyterian missionary, documented the violence in detail and published his accounts. He was sued for libel by Belgian rubber companies. The case became an international sensation, with Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, writing a pamphlet in Shepherd's defense. Shepherd eventually won, but the legal battle was designed to intimidate him and others into silence. Alice Seeley Harris, the missionary whose photographs proved so damning, was threatened and harassed. Her camera equipment was confiscated multiple times. She received death threats, but she persisted, smuggling photographs out of the Congo and distributing them in Europe and America. Her images became some of the first examples of photojournalism used to expose human rights abuses, setting a precedent for later humanitarian campaigns. The photographs showed what words couldn't fully convey: the reality of the suffering. One famous image shows a father, Nsala, sitting in front of his daughter's severed hand and foot. His expression is beyond grief, a kind of hollowed-out devastation that transcends emotional description. This was his daughter. These were her body parts. They were brought to him as evidence of her execution, a casual cruelty designed to punish his failure to meet rubber quotas. Another photograph shows a group of children, all missing hands. They're staring at the camera with expressions mixing fear, confusion, and a terrible resignation. These children will never have normal lives. They'll struggle with basic tasks forever. They'll carry the visible mark of colonial violence on their bodies until they die. And these are the survivors, the ones who didn't bleed out, didn't die from infection, didn't get shot or burned along with their villages. The international campaign against Leopold's Congo was one of the first modern human rights movements. It united people across national and racial lines in opposition to systematic atrocity. It demonstrated the power of photography and eyewitness testimony to shift public opinion. It showed that sustained activism could, eventually, force changes even in systems protected by enormous wealth and power. But the campaign also revealed the limits of international outrage. Leopold was forced to give up personal ownership of the Congo, but Belgian colonial rule continued until 1960, and while it was less spectacularly brutal than Leopold's regime, it remained exploitative and violent. The rubber quotas ended, but forced labor continued in other forms. The hand-cutting stopped, but other forms of coercion and violence replaced it. The system's most visible atrocities were addressed, but its fundamental injustice persisted. When Congo finally achieved independence in 1960, it inherited a devastated nation. Decades of colonial rule had extracted enormous wealth while investing almost nothing in education, infrastructure, or preparation for self-governance. The Belgians had educated exactly 16 Congolese people to university level in the entire colonial period. There were no Congolese doctors, lawyers, or engineers. The country had been deliberately kept powerless and dependent. The chaos and violence that followed independence, including the assassination of Patrice Lumumba and the decades of Mobutu's kleptocratic dictatorship, can be traced directly back to the destruction wrought during colonial rule, especially during Leopold's time. You cannot systematically traumatize and impoverish an entire nation for generations and then expect it to function normally the moment you leave. The scars run too deep. Today, the Democratic Republic of Congo remains one of the poorest countries in the world despite having some of the richest mineral deposits on Earth. The pattern established by Leopold continues: extraction of wealth by outsiders while local people remain impoverished. The resources being extracted have changed: coltan for cell phones, cobalt for batteries, diamonds for jewelry, but the dynamic remains the same. And once again, children are often the victims, working in mines under horrific conditions, their bodies and futures sacrificed for products consumed primarily in wealthy nations. The child laborers in Congolese cobalt mines today are the spiritual descendants of the children who lost their hands collecting rubber for Leopold. The systems have become more complex, more diffuse, harder to pin responsibility on any single villain. But the essential transaction remains unchanged: African children's suffering converted into European and American consumption. If there's a lesson in Leopold's Congo, it's that atrocity thrives in obscurity. The worst abuses happened when Leopold controlled information flow, when he could prevent witnesses from speaking, when he could dismiss criticism as lies. The moment photographs began circulating, when missionaries couldn't be silenced, when the evidence became undeniable, change became possible, though agonizingly slow. We have an obligation to remember these children: the 7-year-old who lost his hand, the daughter whose severed limbs were brought to her father, the babies who died in hostage camps, the boys forced to become child soldiers, the girls taken as sexual slaves, all the millions whose names we don't know but whose suffering was real. We remember not to wallow in historical guilt but to understand patterns that persist. We remember because the same dehumanization that allowed Leopold's atrocities continues today in different forms. We remember because forgetting makes repetition more likely. We remember because these children, though long dead, deserve to have their stories told, their suffering acknowledged, their humanity affirmed. The marble halls of Brussels that Leopold built with rubber money stand as monuments to evil disguised as civilization. But the true monuments should be to the children of the Congo, whose blood and severed hands paid for those buildings, whose lives were sacrificed on the altar of European progress, whose stories remind us that civilization is always skin deep, and beneath it lurks the same capacity for cruelty that has characterized human behavior throughout history. Remember the hands. Remember the children. Remember that behind every statistic about historical atrocities are individuals who suffered, who feared, who died. And remember that our comfortable modern world was often built on foundations of suffering we prefer not to examine too closely. The rubber in our tires, the cobalt in our phones, the chocolate on our shelves, all of it carries carries echoes of the same systems that cut off children's hands in the Congo. Leopold's ghost still haunts us, not in supernatural form, but in the persistent patterns of exploitation, the selective historical memory, the monuments to monsters that stand unchallenged in city squares. Until we fully reckon with this history, until we center the victims rather than their oppressors, until we acknowledge that European civilization was built partly on African graves, we cannot claim to have learned anything from the past. The children of Leopold's Congo are gone, but their legacy remains. In the poverty of their descendants, in the instability of the region, in the continued extraction of wealth from Africa to Europe, and in our collective failure to fully acknowledge and address what happened. We owe them more than memory. We owe them truth, justice delayed though it is, and a commitment to never again allow such systematic destruction of innocence in the name of progress or profit.